The letter arrived on a Tuesday in the spring of 1878, written in a hand John Reed did not recognize, telling him that his mother had been born among the Comanche people of the Texas Panhandle, and that somewhere in the Red Canyon country south of the Canadian River, there were still people who shared her blood. John Reed was 26 years old when he read that letter, standing on the porch of the homestead in Missouri, where he had grown up believing his mother was simply a quiet woman from somewhere unnamed who had died of fever when he was 3. His father, Thomas Reed, had been a closed-mouthed man who answered questions about her with a single press-lip silence that told John everything and nothing all at once. Thomas Reed had died the previous winter, and it was only in going through the old cedar chest in the back room that John found the letter, folded and yellowed and tucked beneath a cracked Bible and a piece of blue ribbon. The letter had been written by a man named Samuel Bright, a schoolteacher and former Army interpreter who had known John's mother, a woman born with a Comanche name that had been shortened and reshaped into the English name Mary when she married Thomas Reed in 1849. Samuel Bright wrote that Mary had left her people voluntarily, driven by love and by fear of what the Army campaigns were doing to her band, and that she had never spoken of them again to anyone except Samuel himself, who had helped her write a single letter back to her family that, to his knowledge, had never received a reply. John folded the letter carefully, tucked it into the breast pocket of his coat, and stood for a long time looking out across the Missouri flatlands in the gray spring light. He had his mother's coloring, he knew that much. Dark hair, dark eyes that did not quite match his father's pale blue ones, a complexion that browned quickly in the sun while his father's had only reddened and peeled. He had grown up with the whispers that followed him through town, the sideways looks, the comments that landed just softly enough that no one had to answer for them. He had never known what to do with any of it. Now he did. He sold the homestead for enough to outfit himself properly, bought a good brown quarter horse he named Ranger, packed his saddlebags with dried beef, cornmeal, coffee, and cartridges for the Colt revolver and the Winchester rifle he strapped behind his saddle, and rode south and west toward Texas. The ride from Missouri to the Texas Panhandle in the spring of 1878 was not a comfortable one. The Civil War had been over for 13 years, but its marks were still everywhere on the land and in the people, the burned homesteads, the uncertain towns, the men with hollow eyes who worked farms they were still trying to believe were theirs. John rode through it all with a purposefulness that kept him moving even on the days when the wind came cold off the plains and the sky turned the color of an old bruise. He was somewhere south of Dodge City, Kansas, when he first heard the name Letitia Brooks. He had stopped at a small trading post on the edge of a dry creek bed, a weathered place with a sagging porch, and a sign that read Hannigan's Goods in letters that had been painted sometime before the war and never repainted since. The man behind the counter, a broad-shouldered fellow with a red beard and a gold tooth, was named Clyde Hannigan, and he was the sort of man who talked to pass the time. "You heading south?" Clyde asked, eyeing John's full saddlebags with the professional interest of a man who sold supplies for a living. "Toward the Panhandle," John said. "Along the Canadian River." Clyde made a low whistling sound. "There's country down there that'll test a man. The buffalo are mostly gone now, but the land doesn't care about that. Still plenty of canyons to get lost in, rivers that run red with clay, winds that'll strip the bark off a cottonwood." He paused. "There's a woman down that way who might be useful to you if you're traveling alone." John looked up from examining a box of cartridges. "What woman?" "Name's Letitia Brooks. Took over her father's homestead about 3 years back when he passed." Old Marcus Brooks was a surveyor and a sometime trader, knew the land down there better than anyone except the Comanche themselves, and he taught his daughter everything. "She's got 40 acres along a tributary of the Canadian, grows enough to get by, trades with the last few bands that are still out there before they get pushed onto the reservation. She knows the country and she knows the people." Clyde leaned on the counter, Word of advice: if you're looking to learn anything about the Comanche bands that still range through that canyon country, she'd be the one to ask. John considered this. How do I find her? Ride south along the east fork of the creek bed until you hit a line of cottonwoods. Follow them west for about 5 miles. You'll see a stone chimney first, then the rest of the house. John paid for his supplies, thanked Clyde, and tucked the information away alongside the letter in his breast pocket. He found the stone chimney exactly where Clyde had said it would be, rising above a small but solid-looking house built from a combination of red stone and split timber, sitting in a shallow bowl of land where the creek ran close enough that its green smell reached him before he could see the water. There was a garden to the south side of the house, already showing the early green of spring planting. There was a small barn, well kept, with its doors standing open to the mild afternoon. There were 2 horses in a paddock beside the barn, a sturdy bay and a pinto, and there was a woman standing at the paddock fence with her back to him, watching the horses with her arms resting on the top rail. She turned when she heard Ranger's hooves on the hard-packed earth of the yard, and John Reed looked at Letitia Brooks for the first time. She was 23 years old, though he would not learn that for several days. She was not tall, but she carried herself in a way that made her seem larger than her actual height. Her hair was the color of dark honey, worn in a practical braid that had partly come loose over the course of what had clearly been a working day. She wore a plain brown dress with a canvas work apron over it, and she had a smear of dark earth on her left forearm where she must have been working the garden. Her eyes, when they met his across the yard, were an unusual shade of gray-green, the color of sage after rain, and they were sharp and direct and entirely unafraid. "Help you?" she said. Her voice was clear and even, not unfriendly but measuring. "My name is John Reed," he said, bringing Ranger to a stop a respectful distance from her. "I was told in Hannigan's that you might be able to give me some information about the land and the people south of here. I'm heading for the Canadian River country." She looked at him steadily for a moment. "Who told you that?" "Clyde Hannigan." A small shift in her expression, a loosening of something careful. "Clyde talks to everybody," she said, not quite smiling. "Get down and water your horse. I'll hear what you need." He unsaddled Ranger and let him drink from the trough beside the barn, while Letitia went to the house and came back with 2 tin cups of coffee, handing him one without ceremony, and leaning against the paddock fence again in that easy way she had, like a woman entirely at home in her own land. "What are you looking for down in the canyon country?" she asked. He told her about the letter. He was not usually a man who gave his personal history to strangers, but there was something in the directness of her gaze that made evasion feel foolish. He told her about the cedar chest, about Samuel Bright's letter, about his mother Mary, born among the Comanche, married to a Missouri farmer, dead of fever when John was 3. He told her he wanted to find whoever remained of his mother's people, if they were still there. Letitia listened without interrupting, which was a quality he noticed because most people did not do it. When he finished, she was quiet for a moment, turning her tin cup slowly in both hands. "The bands in the canyon country," she said at last. "Most of them were pushed onto the reservation at Fort Sill 3 or 4 years ago, after the Red River War in '74. Colonel Mackenzie's campaign." Something tightened briefly in her voice when she said it. "But there are still some families, some elders who are along the Canadian. They don't advertise themselves to the army for obvious reasons. I trade with them sometimes. Salt, coffee, cloth. They trade me cured hides and dried meat." "Do you know if any of them might have known a woman named Mary?" John asked. "She would have left around 1849. Her Comanche name I don't know." Letitia looked at him with those gray-green eyes. "That's a long time ago, but some of the older ones remember everything. There's an elder woman named Estaca who lives with her family along Tule Creek. If anyone would know, she would." John felt something shift in his chest, a loosening of something that had been wound tight for the long weeks of the ride. "Can you take me to her?" Letitia looked at him for a long moment, then out across her land, the garden, the horses, the red-earthed hills to the south. "I can't leave my place for days at a time," she said. "I've got animals and a garden and I'm alone here, but I can draw you a map and I can give you a message to take to them that'll mean they won't shoot you when you show up." He nodded. "I'll take it. You'll stay tonight," she said, and it was not quite a question and not quite a command. "I'll make supper. You look like you've been eating trail food for 2 weeks." He had been eating trail food for 3 weeks, but he did not correct her. She cooked salt pork and cornbread and a kind of thick bean soup that she seasoned with dried peppers, and they ate at the small plank table inside the house, which was plain and well-ordered in a way that told him a great deal about her. The walls held shelves of supplies, a row of books, a pair of rifles, and a framed needlework piece that said simply "home" in thread that had probably been her mother's work. There was a stone fireplace, swept clean, and a writing desk in the corner with papers and what looked like a surveyor's journal that he recognized from the careful columns of numbers and notations. "Was that your father's?" he asked, nodding toward the journal. "His are in the trunk," she said. "That one's mine. I've been resurveying the south section. There are some boundary disputes with a cattle outfit that's been pushing in from the east." He looked at her with what he hoped was not too obvious a surprise. "You survey your own land." "My father taught me," she said simply, without defensiveness. "He said it was the most important thing a person on this land could know. The lines are and how to prove them." "He was right," John said. She glanced at him across the table with a look that acknowledged the agreement without making much of it. "Where did you work before this?" she asked. "Before you decided to come looking?" "I worked my father's land in Missouri," he said. "Corn and wheat mostly. Then I worked 2 seasons on a cattle drive from Texas up to Abilene back in '75 and '76. Learned the country from the saddle. So you know what you're riding into." "I know the Texas Panhandle from a cattle drive perspective," he said, "which means I know the rivers and the grazing and the trails. I don't know the canyon country the way you're describing it." "No," she agreed. "Most men don't." She said it without scorn, just accuracy. After supper she drew him the map by lamplight, working carefully on a piece of good paper with a pen that she dipped precisely, drawing the creek lines and the canyon walls and the stand of post oak that would tell him he was close to Tule Creek. She wrote at the bottom of the map a message in a phonetically rendered version of Comanche words that she had learned from years of trading, and she explained to him what it meant. That he came in peace, that he was looking for family, that Letitia Brooks had sent him. "If you show that to the first person who sees you," she said, "and if you keep your rifle in the scabbard and your hands where they can see them, they'll decide what to do with you. Estaca will understand when she reads the first part of your letter about your mother. You think she'll talk to me? I think if your mother was from that band, Estaca will want to talk to you," Letitia said. "She's a woman who believes family is worth crossing any distance to find." Something in how she said it made him look at her more carefully, and he thought he saw something quiet and complicated move through her expression before she folded the map and handed it to him. He slept in the barn that night on clean straw with his saddle for a pillow and the smell of horses around him, which was a smell he found genuinely restful. In the morning, Letitia had coffee on the fire and fresh cornbread, and she handed him a cloth sack with dried beef and dried fruit and a small wrapped package of coffee. "For the trail," she said. He took it and felt with a kind of awkward clarity that he did not want to ride away from this house and this woman quite yet. The feeling was specific and unexpected, and he did not entirely know what to do with it, so he simply thanked her and mounted Ranger and rode south. He followed her map with the care of a man who understood what good directions meant in open country, and on the 3rd day he found the stand of post oak and the creek and the small cluster of brush shelters and one frame tent set along the bank in a grove of cottonwoods where the shade was good. He kept his rifle in the scabbard and his hands on the pommel, and he waited while 3 young men on horses appeared from somewhere and surrounded him with expressions that were measuring and not entirely unfriendly. He held up the paper. One of them took it, read it, looked at him with a reassessed expression, and said something to the others. They rode together to the camp. Estaca was a woman who appeared to be somewhere in her 70s, small and deeply lined and wrapped in a striped blanket despite the warmth of the day. She was sitting on a folded hide outside the largest shelter, and she held John's map and Letitia's message for a long time before she looked up at him. She spoke through a young woman named Nana who translated haltingly but adequately. Estaca asked him his mother's English name and the year she had left. She asked him to describe her, what little he knew from his father's few reluctant descriptions. Small, dark-eyed, a scar on her right hand from a childhood burn, a particular way of humming to herself when she was working. Estaca listened to all of it. Then she closed her eyes. Then she opened them and began to speak slowly and with great care, and Nana translated that she had known a woman who matched that description, that the woman's Comanche name meant something like bright water, that she had left in 1849 with a man from the East, a choice her family had grieved but accepted, that her mother, Estaca's oldest friend, had passed away in 1863 during the terrible years of the Army campaigns, that there was one living relative remaining, Estaca herself, who was Bright Water's mother's sister's daughter, a second cousin in the English reckoning. John Reed sat in the dappled cottonwood shade with the sounds of the creek nearby and the smell of smoke from a cookfire, and felt something inside him, something he had not previously been able to name as an absence, suddenly fill. He spent 4 days with Estaca and her family. He helped with firewood and water carrying, and the small practical tasks of camp life that he knew how to do without being asked. He listened to Nana translate stories about his mother's childhood, the games she had played, the horse she had loved, the songs her mother had sung. He learned to say his mother's name correctly. He learned that she had been known as a quick and clever child who was very good at reading weather, which explained, John thought, the way his own instincts about rain and wind were finely tuned in a way his Missouri neighbors had always found slightly uncanny. On the 4th evening, Estaca gave him a small piece of worked buckskin, painted with symbols in red and yellow. Nana told him it had belonged to his mother, that Estaca had kept it since the year Bright Water left, not knowing if she would ever find someone to give it to. John accepted it with both hands, as Nana told him was proper, and he held it for a long time without speaking. When he rode away from Tule Creek on the 5th morning, he was different in a way he could not fully articulate, as if the letter and the ride and the 4 days in the cottonwood shade had completed some circuit in him that had always been open and buzzing quietly with the energy of an unfinished thing. He rode north. He told himself it was the most logical direction. He told himself he needed to resupply. He told himself there was no particular reason he was retracing the exact route that would bring him past a stone chimney, and a well-kept barn, and a woman with gray-green eyes who had drawn him a map by lamplight. He arrived at Letitia Brooks's homestead on a clear, warm afternoon with the sky entirely blue and a hawk circling high above the creek cottonwoods. She was in the garden when he rode in, kneeling between the rows with a hoe, and she stood up and shaded her eyes to look at him. "You're back," she said. "I found them," he said. "I found Estaca." Something bright moved through her expression. "She knew your mother." "She did." He dismounted and stood with Ranger's reins in his hands, feeling somehow that he ought to explain himself for returning without an obvious errand. "I wanted to tell you, since you made it possible." Letitia looked at him for a moment, then down at the hoe in her hands, then back at him. "Come inside," she said. "I'll hear it." He told her everything over coffee and the biscuits she had somehow produced in the time it took him to unsaddle Ranger and water him at the trough. He told her about Estaca and Nana and the stories and the piece of painted buckskin, which he took carefully from his breast pocket and showed her. She held it with the same reverence he had felt, turning it gently, looking at the symbols. "Red and yellow," she said softly, "red for the earth and yellow for the sun. Those were important colors for the Comanche bands in this region." She handed it back to him carefully. "She kept it all those years." 30 years, John said. She kept it 30 years not knowing if it would ever reach anyone. Letitia looked at him across the table with those gray-green eyes, and there was something in her expression that was not quite sadness and not quite happiness but some precise combination of both that he thought was the expression of a person who understood long waiting. "How long have you been alone here?" he asked. It was perhaps too direct, but she was a direct person, and he found that directness was easier with her than with most. "My father died in 1875, she said. "So 3 years. My mother died when I was 11. I have a brother in Kansas City, but we don't correspond much. He thought I was foolish not to sell when father died." She paused. "I couldn't leave this land. My father's whole work is in it, and mine." "It's good land," John said. "It is," she said, with a firmness that told him she had defended that statement before and would not stop defending it. He stayed 2 nights, sleeping in the barn again, and in the daytime he made himself useful. The boundary dispute she had mentioned was a real and pressing problem, and when she explained it to him, he went with her to walk the south section, where she showed him her father's original survey markers and her own resurvey notes, and the evidence that a cattle outfit run by a man named Dawson had been incrementally moving a fence line 3 or 4 feet at a time, which over half a mile of boundary added up to a significant encroachment. "Have you talked to Dawson?" John asked. "I sent him a letter in February," she said. "He replied that his men must have made an error and he would look into it. That was the last I heard. Do you have the original survey documents?" "My father's originals and my resurvey, yes. I've been planning to ride to the county seat and file a formal complaint, but I haven't been able to leave the place long enough." John was quiet for a moment, looking at the misplaced fence posts with the measuring eye of a man who had spent 2 cattle drive seasons understanding exactly how much land was worth and how many ways men found to take it from people who weren't watching. "Let me ride to the county seat," he said. She looked at him quickly. "That's not your concern." "I know it isn't," he said, "but I know how to talk to land registrars and I have time and you don't. Let me take your documents and file the complaint. It's a 3-day round trip. Your land will be here when you get back, and so will your evidence." She was quiet for a moment, looking out across the disputed line. He could see her calculating, the independence that had kept her here alone for 3 years weighing against the practical reality of what needed to be done. "Why would you do that?" she asked. He considered the honest answer. "Because you helped me find something I'd been missing my whole life," he said. "And because the Dawson situation is exactly the kind of thing that gets worse if you wait." She looked at him for a long moment with that measuring gray-green gaze. Then she said, "All right." He rode to the county seat with her documents carefully wrapped in oilcloth in his saddlebag, filed the formal survey dispute with the land registrar, paid the filing fee from his own pocket, and was back at her homestead by the evening of the 3rd day with the receipts and a copy of the registered complaint that would now require Dawson to appear before the county board or concede the boundary. When he handed her the documents, she looked through them carefully, then looked up at him. "You paid the filing fee," she said. "It wasn't much." "That wasn't what I asked." He almost smiled. "I paid it because I had it and you've been feeding me biscuits for 3 days, he said. Something moved through her expression that was quick and warm and gone before he could be certain he had seen it. "Stay for supper," she said. He stayed for supper. He stayed for breakfast. He stayed for the next 2 weeks. It happened gradually and then all at once, the way such things do when 2 people who are each accustomed to self-sufficiency find themselves in the company of someone who does not require them to be smaller than they are. He was good with horses, which she noticed and appreciated because the bay was going through a difficult period of hoof soreness and needed patient handling. He was a capable carpenter, which was useful because the barn's back wall had a section of siding that had been coming loose since winter. He did not explain himself excessively, which she appreciated, and he did not require to be entertained or thanked for every ordinary thing he did, which she appreciated even more. She was the most competent person he had been around since his grandmother, and his grandmother had been a formidable woman. Letitia read the weather and the grass and the creek levels with the ease of long practice. She knew her plants and her animals and her land the way some people know their own bodies, from the inside out. She cooked well and she thought carefully, and she said things that surprised him regularly, which was a quality he had not previously understood he valued, until he found himself looking forward to conversation the way he looked forward to coffee in the morning. It was on a warm evening in late May when the thing that had been growing between them became impossible to ignore. They were sitting on the porch after supper in the cooling air, watching the last of the light go out of the western sky in long horizontal bands of orange and rose, and a purple blue that was almost too beautiful to be real. The hawk that hunted along the creek was making its last passes. The horses were settled in the paddock. The evening smelled of the garden and the creek and the cedar wood burning down in the stove inside. "What will you do now?" Letitia asked, "now that you've found what you came looking for?" It was the question he had been asking himself for 2 weeks and had not answered deliberately. "I don't know yet," he said. She looked out at the darkening sky. "You could go back to Missouri." "There's nothing in Missouri for me now," he said. "I sold the homestead." "You could go anywhere," she said. Her voice was even and careful in the way that meant she was being very precise about what she was saying. "I could," he said. He turned his head and looked at her profile in the fading light, the particular curve of her jaw and the way her braid had come partly loose again over the course of the day, which he had noticed it did every day by evening without fail. "I don't particularly want to." She was still for a moment. Then she turned and looked at him with those gray-green eyes, and in the low light he could see that she was not quite composed, which was an unusual thing for Letitia Brooks. "This is good land," he said. "You said so yourself." "I did," she said. "And it's your land," he said carefully. "I'm not making any claim on it. I want to be clear about that." "I know that," she said, with a certainty that told him she had indeed known it, had been watching him for 2 weeks and catalogued all the ways he had not tried to make himself master of something that was hers. "That's not what I'm thinking about." "What are you thinking about?" he asked. She was quiet for long enough that the first star appeared in the east. Then she said, "I've been alone here for 3 years and it's been all right. I know how to be alone. I was good at it." She paused. "But these past 2 weeks I've been noticing that I like talking to you at supper. And I like that you fixed the barn wall without making it into a thing that needed to be remarked upon. And I like that you know when to be quiet." Another pause. "I don't know what to do with that." John Reed felt something in his chest that was warm and sure and somewhat terrifying. "Neither do I," he said honestly, "but I think I'd like to find out." She looked at him for a long moment. Then she said with the directness that was entirely characteristic of her, "If you're going to court me, John Reed, I'd like you to say so plainly. I'm not good at doing things by implication." He felt a smile move across his face that he had no particular desire to suppress. "Letitia Brooks," he said, "I would very much like to court you." She nodded once with a composure that did not entirely hide the fact that she was pleased. "All right," she said. "Then you should know that I'm not going to be easy about it. I have opinions." "I've noticed," he said, "and I'm not leaving this land. I know that too, and I don't make decisions quickly. 3 weeks of watching you make decisions tells me you make them very well and somewhat at your own pace," he said. "I can wait." She looked at him with something that was close to the warmth she usually kept banked and controlled. "Good," she said. The courtship of Letitia Brooks was, as she had promised, not simple. But it was also, in a way John had not expected, one of the most genuinely satisfying experiences of his adult life. She debated with him over the breakfast table about land management and weather patterns and the injustice of the reservation system, with an equal-footed intelligence that made every conversation worth having. She let him in slowly and with care, like a woman who had learned to be precise about what she invested in and why. But when she let him in, she let him in all the way. He learned that she had been reading every newspaper account she could find of the Red River War and the forced removal of the Comanche and Kiowa bands, and that it made her furious in a specific, clear-eyed way that she channeled into her trading relationships, and into refusing to cooperate with any land grab that encroached on what little remained. He learned that she had strong feelings about biscuits, and that her method for making them was, in her view, the only correct method, and she was not wrong. He learned that she sang to herself sometimes when she was working in the garden, old hymns and folk songs mixed together in a slightly off-key but entirely unself-conscious way that he found quietly wonderful. She learned that he was an exceptionally patient man who had developed that patience through the difficult years of being his father's son, carrying a heritage his father had refused to name, and managing the complicated feelings that came with it. She learned that he was genuinely funny in a dry, understated way, and that this quality appeared most strongly when he was comfortable, which it had taken him 3 weeks to become. She learned that he had a way with her horses that was almost instinctive, and that the Pinto, who did not particularly like strangers, had decided within a week that John was not a stranger. In June, Dawson's cattle outfit made the mistake of sending 2 of their men to remove the survey stakes along the south boundary, while Letitia and John were out riding the fence line. They came around a bend in the fence and found the men in the act of pulling stakes, and John sat very still on Ranger and looked at the 2 men with an expression that was entirely calm and entirely serious. "Those stakes are part of a registered county survey," John said. "Putting them back where you found them would be the wisest thing you've done today." The men looked at him, then at Letitia, then at each other. One of them started to say something dismissive about a woman's survey, and John said, still in the same calm voice, "She has a registered complaint on file and a copy of the original survey documents. If those stakes are not in the ground by the time we ride back this way in 10 minutes, she'll have the county marshal here by the end of the week." Letitia said nothing. She did not need to. She had the expression of a woman who had already won this argument in a courthouse and knew it. The men put the stakes back. Dawson himself rode over the following week, a red-faced broad man on a big gray horse, and he was not pleasant about it. But he was not stupid either, and when Letitia showed him the registered survey documents and the copy of the county complaint, he read them with the expression of a man recalculating odds. He left without acknowledging that he was backing down, which was as close as he was likely to get, and Letitia watched him go with a satisfaction she did not feel the need to express at any length. "That's done," she said. "For now," John said. "For now," she agreed. "Men like Dawson don't stop looking for edges, but he knows the survey is on record and he knows I'll use it." She paused. "I appreciate you being here for that." "You would have handled it without me," he said. "I would have," she agreed. "But having you here meant he took it seriously 30 seconds sooner, which might matter. I'm not sentimental about that. It's just the way it is." He looked at her with a great deal of respect and said nothing, which she seemed to understand as the correct response. In July, he rode back to Tule Creek to visit Estaca again, and this time he brought good coffee and salt and a bolt of sturdy cloth that Letitia had selected, knowing what would be useful. He sat with Estaca in the cottonwood shade, and Nana translated, and he told Estaca about finding the letter and riding south, and what it had meant to hear his mother's name spoken by someone who had known her. Estaca listened and then spoke for a long time, and Nana translated her words about the importance of knowing where you come from, about how a person who does not know their roots is like a cottonwood in a drought, still standing but not drawing water. He told Estaca about Letitia. He was not sure why, except that talking to Estaca had a quality of clarity to it, as if the translation process required him to think carefully about what he actually meant before he said it. Estaca asked through Nana whether this woman was good on the land. John said yes. Estaca asked whether she was honest. John said yes, she was about the most honest person he had ever met, sometimes uncomfortably so. Estaca made a sound that Nana said meant something like "that is the only kind worth keeping," and John felt a warmth in his chest that he rode all the way back to Letitia's homestead with. It was a Saturday evening in late July, the air still warm but with the first hint of the drier heat of August coming in from the south, when John sat beside Letitia on the porch and said what had been organizing itself in him for several weeks. "I'd like to stay," he said, "permanently. If you'll have me." She looked at him. The sky was doing its extraordinary evening thing again, all those impossible colors. "That's a large thing to say," she said. "It's a large thing to mean," he said, "but I mean it." "You've been here 2 months," she said. "I know. That's not very long." "I know that too." He looked at her with the patient steadiness that was perhaps the most essentially himself quality he possessed. "I'm not asking you to decide anything tonight. I'm telling you what I want so that you can think about it properly. You said you like to make decisions carefully." She was quiet for a moment. The hawk made its pass over the creek. "What would you do here?" She said finally, "This is my land, my homestead. I'm not interested in being a wife who steps back while her husband takes over." "I know," he said. "I wouldn't want that either. I'm good with horses and I'm a capable farmer. I know cattle. If we worked this place together, we could expand what's producing. Maybe add a third paddock and run a small horse operation. There's demand for good quarter horses from the ranches to the east. It would be your operation. I'd be part of it." She considered this with the careful seriousness she gave to every substantive thing. "The horse operation is interesting," she said. "I thought it might be." "You've been thinking about this for a while," she said. "A few weeks," he admitted. She looked at him for a long moment in the warm evening light. "Give me time to think," she said. "All right," he said. He did not press her. He did not bring it up again for 3 weeks. He worked the land and handled the horses and fixed 2 additional things that needed fixing: a gate hinge and a section of the garden fence where a rabbit had been getting through. And he cooked supper twice without being asked, because she came in late from a trading run to a family near the creek, and he had seen she would be tired. She came home from that trading run to find supper on the table and him reading at the desk by lamplight, and she stood in the doorway for a moment looking at the scene with an expression he did not see because his back was half to her, and if he had seen it, he might have understood that the decision had already been made. She told him on a Sunday morning in August while they were both drinking coffee on the porch in the early light, before the day got hot. "I've been thinking about what you said," she said. "I thought you might have been," he said. "The horse operation is a good idea," she said. "We'd need to be careful about the bloodlines we start with, but the market is there. You're right about that." She paused. "And I think you're a good man, John Reed. You're honest and you're patient and you don't try to make yourself bigger than you are, which is rarer than it ought to be." "Thank you," he said. "I'm not finished," she said. "I want to be very clear that this is my land and my homestead and those things don't change." "They don't change," he agreed. "And I want us to be equals in this. In everything. In the work and in the decisions. That's all I want," he said. She looked at him. Then she said, with the characteristic Letitia Brooks directness that he had come to love, with a specificity and certainty that surprised him every time he looked at it directly, "Then yes, I'll have you." He looked at her for a moment in the morning light, in the particular way a man looks at something he has wanted and is not yet accustomed to being allowed. Then he reached across and took her hand, which was a practical, work-worn hand that fit well against his, and she looked down at their joined hands and back up at him. "We should probably get married before winter," she said. He laughed, which was a sound that came from somewhere genuine, and she looked briefly startled and then quietly pleased, because she had not heard him laugh like that before, fully and without restraint, and she thought she would like to hear it again. "Before winter," he agreed. They were married in September of 1878 in the small church at the nearest town, 14 miles east, with a minister named Caldwell officiating and Clyde Hannigan serving as witness on John's side, and a woman named Ruth Garvey, who was Letitia's nearest neighbor at 12 miles distance, on Letitia's side. It was not a large wedding. It was a real one. Letitia wore her best dress, which was a deep blue that did something complicated and good to her gray-green eyes, and John wore his good coat and had made an effort with his hair, which she noted and appreciated. After the ceremony, Clyde shook John's hand with the enthusiasm of a man who felt he had personally contributed to the outcome, which he felt he had, and perhaps was not entirely wrong about. Ruth Garvey hugged Letitia with the warmth of a woman who was genuinely glad for her friend's happiness, and said in Letitia's ear that she had worried about her being out there alone, and now she could stop worrying. To which Letitia replied with characteristic practicality that she had never needed anyone to worry about her, but that she was glad Ruth could worry less. They drove home in the wagon in the late afternoon light, and the land around them was the gold and rust of early autumn, the grasses bent in the warm south wind, the red earth showing through where the track curved around the base of a low hill. Letitia sat beside him on the wagon seat with her shoulder against his arm, which was not her usual way of sitting, and he was aware of it with every part of him. "We're home," she said, as they came over the last rise and the stone chimney came into view against the sky. "We are," he said. The first winter they spent as husband and wife was a long and particular one, the kind of winter that tests what a thing is made of, with 3 weeks of genuine hard cold in January that froze the creek and kept them mostly inside, tending the animals twice daily and spending the long evenings by the fire. They argued twice, properly and with some heat, once about the best approach to expanding the paddock, and once about something smaller that neither of them would clearly remember afterward, and both arguments resolved into something better than where they had started, which was how John came to understand that disagreements with Letitia were not combat, but a form of extremely direct conversation. He learned her completely that winter, the way she took her coffee, the way she thought best in the early morning before the day's demands arrived, the way she laughed at things that surprised her, always slightly as if laughing was something she had not planned to do and found herself doing anyway. He learned that she had nightmares sometimes, quiet ones where she woke tense and still, and that she did not want to be fussed over but did want a hand on her back for a moment while she settled. He learned that she kept her father's survey journals and read them sometimes when she missed him, the way some people kept letters. She learned him in the deep ways that only winter closeness teaches. She learned that he woke early and lay quiet before rising, a habit from years of not wanting to disturb a sleeping household. She learned that he carried the questions of his own heritage with a kind of resolved thoughtfulness, that he had found what he needed in those 4 days at Tule Creek, and was not haunted by what remained unknown, which she thought showed a particular quality of settled wisdom in a man of 26. She learned that he was capable of great tenderness, and that he expressed it most often in action rather than speech, in the specific way he anticipated what was needed before it was said. By spring of 1879, the horse operation was underway. John had ridden to 3 ranches east of them over the winter, making contacts and understanding the market, and in March, he brought home 2 mares of excellent quarter-horse stock from a ranch in the next county, good bloodlines and sound legs, which he bought with the last of the homestead money he had not yet spent. Letitia had reviewed the animals with the same careful precision she brought to her survey work before she agreed they were worth the price. They built the 3rd paddock together in April, working from a plan Letitia had drawn in the surveyor's journal. It took 3 weeks, working the better part of most days, and by the end of it they were both tired in the bone-deep way that comes from good hard work, and the paddock was solid and well-built and would serve them for years. In May, Letitia told him she was expecting a child, standing in the kitchen with the morning light coming through the window and a directness that was, as always, her fundamental mode. John Reed stood in his kitchen in the spring light and felt the kind of happiness that is almost frightening in its size, the kind that makes a man aware of how much he now has to lose and decides immediately that this awareness is worth it. "Are you all right?" he asked. "I'm perfectly fine," she said. "It's early yet. I wanted you to know." He crossed the kitchen and put his arms around her with a care and a fullness that she leaned into, which was not her usual way of inhabiting an embrace, and told him something true about how she was feeling beneath the practicality. "Good," he said into her hair. That's very good. She was, as she had predicted, perfectly fine through most of it. She worked the garden into August and managed the horse trading correspondence until October, and only conceded to slowing down when the baby announced itself as close by the sheer physical reality of the matter. John took on the extra work without commentary, and did it without it becoming anything that needed to be noticed or compensated for, which she understood was his form of care and valued accordingly. The child arrived in January of 1880, a boy, born in the homestead with Ruth Garvey and a practical midwife named Clara Simmons, who had ridden 14 miles through the cold to help. John stayed close through all of it, doing what was useful and staying out of the way when that was what was needed, which Clara told Letitia afterward was rare and admirable in a husband. They named him Marcus Thomas Reed, for Letitia's father and John's father both, which was a decision they had made together over the long autumn evenings without much argument, both understanding that naming a child after the people who had made you was an act of acknowledgement that mattered. Marcus Thomas Reed was, from his first days, an opinionated and alert infant who expressed himself clearly and at volume, which John said was entirely his mother's son and Letitia said was a quality she was quite certain came from the Reed side, which made John laugh in that full, unguarded way she had come to collect like something precious. Spring came early in 1880, and with it a letter from Nana at Tule Creek, writing on behalf of Estaca, who was not well but who wanted John and his wife to visit when they could manage it. John showed Letitia the letter and she read it and said they would go as soon as the ground was firm enough to travel, and she could arrange for Ruth Garvey's oldest boy to look after the horses. They made the journey in April, with Marcus in a carrier that John had built through the winter from a design Letitia found in one of her father's reference books on frontier life, a sturdy wooden-framed thing that strapped securely to the saddle and was padded inside with sheepskin. Letitia rode the Pinto and John rode Ranger, and Marcus slept for most of the first day with the serene confidence of a child who had been told the world was his by virtue of his parents' combined stubbornness. Estaca was smaller than she had been the previous year, and she moved more slowly, but her eyes were still sharp and clear, and she looked at Marcus for a long time before she spoke. Nana translated. She said he had his great-grandmother's cheekbones, Bright Water's mother's cheekbones, which was a thing that could be said only by someone who had known Bright Water's mother well, and therefore a thing that meant a great deal. Letitia sat beside John with the baby in her arms while Estaca spoke, and Nana translated long stories about the canyon country and the old ways, and the history of the band that had once ranged freely across the red earth plains that now had John and Letitia's fence lines and Dawson's cattle and the Army's reservation boundaries drawn across them. It was not a comfortable history to sit with, and Letitia did not look away from it. "It's a hard thing," she said to John that evening when they had made camp a little way from the creek in a clearing of cottonwoods. "What was taken from these people?" "It is," he said. He was looking at the fire, and she knew he was thinking about his mother's people and the decades between 1849 when Brightwater left and 1874 when the Red River War ended the last free life of the Texas Comanche bands. "My mother left before the worst of it, but she must have known it was coming. She was reading the signs. She was trying to survive," Letitia said, "the way people do." "Yes," he said. He looked at Marcus, sleeping in the carrier between them, warm and entirely unconscious of the complicated history of the earth beneath him. "I want him to know it," John said. "All of it. The Missouri side and the Comanche side and the reason both of them matter." "He'll know it," Letitia said with certainty. "We'll make sure of it." John looked at her, this woman who was his wife and his equal and the most grounded person he had ever known, and felt the particular gratitude of a man who has found someone who meets him where he actually is rather than where it would be convenient for him to be. "Thank you for coming here with me," he said. "This is part of your life," she said simply, "so it's part of mine." He reached across and took her hand in the firelight, and she looked down at their joined hands with the same expression she had had on the porch that first evening, warm and carefully held. And he thought again, as he had thought many times, that he would spend the rest of his life being glad he had followed a surveyor's daughter's map into the canyon country and come back north again. They visited Estaca one more time in August of 1880, and Estaca was weaker but still present, still sharp-eyed, and she spent a long time speaking to Nana, and then through Nana to John and Letitia. And what she said was essentially what she had said in different forms every time John had visited. That family was the thing worth crossing any distance to find, that the land remembered everything even when the people forgot, and that a person who stood on the land of their mothers and fathers was standing on something that could not be fully taken away. Estaca passed away in the autumn of 1880. Nana sent word by a writer who made the 2-day trip to bring the letter, and Letitia read it to John at the kitchen table in the early morning, and he sat with it for a while without speaking. Then he took the piece of painted buckskin from where it lived now on the shelf beside Letitia's father's survey journals, and held it for a moment, the red and yellow symbols that had belonged to his mother and had waited 30 years in Estaca's careful keeping. "She found someone to give it to," Letitia said quietly. "She did," John said. "He placed it back on the shelf with the care of a man who understands the weight of an object that outlived the people who loved it." And then, because he was John Reed and this was how he moved through grief, he put on his coat and went out to start the morning work, and Letitia let him, because she knew him well enough to know that useful work was how he processed the large things. The horse operation grew through 1880 and 1881 into something genuinely profitable. 3 mares now producing foals of the consistent quarter horse quality that the ranches to the east had come to rely on. John had a gift for the work that was not simply technical. It was something more intuitive, a quality of attention and patience that the horses responded to, and buyers began to come to them rather than the other way around, which was the best kind of situation in any business. Letitia managed the trading side with the same precise intelligence she brought to everything, keeping detailed records in the surveyor's journals that she had begun for the purpose, and negotiating with buyers in the direct, fair-dealing manner that built a reputation that spread without advertising. By the autumn of 1881, they had paid off the cost of the original mares and were operating at a profit that, while not large, was genuine and growing. The boundary dispute with Dawson resurfaced once, in the spring of 1881, when 2 of his cowboys were found fixing a new fence line that once again encroached on the south section. This time John rode to Dawson's ranch house directly and had a conversation with Dawson that was brief and clear, and referenced the registered survey documents and the county board's existing ruling, and Dawson's legal exposure if it went further. Dawson was not a man who backed down easily, but he was also not a man who liked legal expenses, and the fence came down within the week. "I don't think he'll try again," John told Letitia when he came home. "He will," she said, "but he'll wait long enough that he's hoping we've forgotten." "We won't forget," John said. "No," she agreed. "We won't." She was right that Dawson waited, and right that they did not forget. And when he tried a third time in 1883 with a more sophisticated argument about a supposedly faulty original survey point, Letitia was ready for it with a resurvey she had done herself the previous year and a secondary survey she had commissioned from the county surveyor. Dawson lost that argument in front of the county board and did not try again, which was a final victory that Letitia received with a satisfaction she allowed herself to feel fully for approximately 1 evening before returning to the next thing that needed doing. In the summer of 1882, Letitia told John she was expecting again. This announcement came at breakfast, same as the first one, same kitchen, different light, spring rather than autumn. John looked up from his coffee with the expression of a man who is already calculating the additional work of a newborn against the current state of the horse operation, and the garden and Marcus, who at 2.5 was a determined and enthusiastic person who required consistent attention, and who is deciding in the same moment that none of these calculations reduce the warmth of how he feels about what he has just been told. "Are you all right?" he asked, same as before. "Perfectly fine," she said, same as before, and he smiled. This child came in February of 1883, a girl this time, who arrived with less drama than Marcus, but with an equal quantity of alert dark eyes that looked around the room from her first hours with what Clara Simmons, who had ridden the 14 miles again without complaint, described as the look of a person making notes. They named her Clara Estaca Reed, for the midwife who had come both times through cold and distance, and for the elder woman who had kept a piece of painted buckskin for 30 years and given it to a man she had just met, because she understood that family was worth finding. Letitia Reed, writing in her journal that evening while the baby slept, and John sat with Marcus by the fire reading to him in the low voice that Marcus had always found settling, wrote that she thought the name was right, that it connected things that ought to be connected, the practical and the sacred, the woman who helped you arrive, and the woman who helped you know where you came from. Marcus at 2.5 was uncertain about the baby for approximately 3 days, after which he decided she was interesting, and thereafter treated her with a proprietorial interest that manifested as bringing her things, small stones, a cottonwood leaf, one of John's boot laces that he had removed without permission, and presenting them to her with the seriousness of a boy conducting an experiment. Ruth Garvey, who came to visit a week after the birth, looked at the household, the children and the clean kitchen and the shelves with Letitia's surveyed journals next to John's horse operation ledger next to the Bible and the row of books and the piece of painted buckskin. And she said to Letitia, in the particular quiet way of a good friend saying an important thing, "You've made something real here." "We have," Letitia said, and meant it with a fullness that she would have found difficult to articulate in the early years of being alone on this land, when making something real had been what she was trying to do, but the we of it had not existed yet. In the spring of 1883, Nana sent a letter saying that she and her family were being formally relocated to the reservation at Fort Sill, that the last of the families along Tule Creek were going in, and that she wanted John and Letitia to know because they had been kind, and because she thought they would want to know. The letter carried a weight that John and Letitia both felt, the finality of something that had been happening for decades and was now complete in this particular place. John wrote back to Nana at the Fort Sill address she had included, a careful and warm letter that took him 3 evenings to write, working at the desk by lamplight while the household slept. He wrote about Estaca and what she had meant to him, and about the piece of buckskin on the shelf, and about Marcus and Clara, and the way the land was in good April color. He wrote that he did not forget where the land's history came from. He wrote that he hoped Nana and her family would find dignity and sufficiency at Fort Sill, knowing as he wrote it that this was a hope the realities of reservation life in 1883 might not support, but that hope was what he had to offer across the distance. Nana wrote back in June, a shorter letter, thanking him and telling him that Estaca had spoken of him until very near the end, that she had been glad to have found bright water's son, that she had felt that was something properly finished. The letter ended with a phrase in Comanche that Nana translated in parentheses as something like, "May the ground under your feet be your own." John read the letter at the kitchen table and then brought it to where Letitia was sitting by the fire with Clara, who was 4 months old and presently fixated on her own fingers, as if this was a discovery of profound significance. He read Letitia the last line. She was quiet for a moment. Then she looked around the room, the solid walls, the shelves, the sleeping Marcus, the fire, the wide dark window with the April night beyond it. "It is," she said. "The years that followed were good years, built years, the kind that accumulate into a life without the drama of their beginning, but with a substance that drama cannot produce on its own." The horse operation reached a size that required hiring, and in 1884 they brought on a young man named Eli Torres, who was 19 and the son of a Mexican vaquero, and had grown up with horses in a way that complemented John's instincts with a different set of skills, and who was honest and hardworking and was treated by the Reeds as part of the operation without condition. Marcus started school in 1885, riding the 12 miles to town on the bay, who was gentle enough for a child and needed the exercise, with a lunch pail and a reading primer, and the look of a boy who had inherited from his mother the quality of approaching new situations with precise attention. His teacher, a young woman named Miss Abernathy who was new from St. Louis and slightly overwhelmed by the practical directness of frontier children, wrote in her first report that Marcus Reed was exceptionally attentive and had asked more questions in his first week than most children asked in a month. John read this report and said to Letitia, "He's his mother's son." Letitia read it and said, "He's asked every question twice. He's his father's son." Clara, at 2, was already following the horses along the paddock fence and attempting to communicate with them in a vocabulary that was mostly her own invention, but that the horses seemed to find acceptable. She had John's dark coloring and Letitia's gray-green eyes, which was a combination that Clyde Hannigan, when he visited in the spring of 1885, described as the prettiest and most serious face he had seen in 20 years of trading, which made Letitia say with characteristic directness that she hoped Clara would be known for something more useful than her face, and John said she would be, and they were both right. The stone chimney stood through all of it, through the winters and the springs, through the children's growing and the horse operations expansion, and the garden's annual riot of green in May and gold in October. Letitia's survey journals filled and were followed by new ones. John's horse ledgers were meticulous and showed, by 1886, a trajectory that meant financial security in a real and unambiguous way. He did not stop thinking about where he came from, but the thinking had changed quality over the years, had become something integrated and settled rather than the searching, buzzing uncertainty of that spring morning in Missouri when he had read Samuel Bright's letter for the first time. He knew who he was in a way that had room for all of it: the Missouri homestead and his father's closed silence, his mother's Comanche name and the cottonwood shade at Tule Creek, the piece of painted buckskin on the shelf, and this house, this land, this woman and these children. On a particular evening in October of 1886, after a long day that had been good and ordinary in the best possible way, John and Letitia sat on the porch in the cooling air. It was an evening much like the one, 8 years earlier, when she had told him she liked talking to him at supper. The sky was doing its October thing, all deep orange and the particular blue that comes just before stars, and the hawk was making its last pass over the creek cottonwoods, and the horses were settled in the paddock, and the house behind them was warm with lamplight, and the sounds of 2 children approaching sleep. Letitia had her feet up on the porch rail, which was a thing she did on evenings when she felt thoroughly herself, and her head was tipped back slightly looking at the first stars. "It's been a good day," she said. "It has," he said. He was looking at her in the last of the light, this woman who had drawn him a map with precise, careful pen strokes, and told him what it meant to show up among people with your hands visible and your intentions clear, who had stood her ground against a cattle outfit and a county registrar, and 3 weeks of hard cold in January, and the grief of losing her father with the same practical, steady quality she brought to everything, who had agreed to let him court her with the condition that she had opinions and she was not leaving her land, and who had kept both conditions without exception. "I want to tell you something," he said. She looked at him with those gray-green eyes. "Tell me." "I came south looking for where I came from," he said, "and I found Estaca and the stories and the buckskin and all of that is real and it matters. But what I found that I didn't expect, what I didn't know I was looking for, was this." He gestured, a small gesture that meant the house and the land and the children and her, all of it. I found out who I am by finding out who I am with." She was quiet for a moment, the way she was quiet when something landed in her, and she was being precise about how she held it. Then she said, "That's the most you've said at one time in possibly 8 years." He smiled, and she looked at his smile with the expression of a woman who has collected something and is adding to the collection. "I mean it," he said. "I know you do," she said. "I mean it back." She said it simply because she was Letitia Brooks Reed and she did not dress things in more words than they needed. But the simplicity of it was the thing itself, not a smaller version of it. She reached over and took his hand in the October dark, the warm, worn hand of a woman who had surveyed her own land, and planted her own garden, and raised 2 children and built a horse operation, and stood down a cattle outfit with survey documents and sheer personal certainty. The hand of the woman who had drawn him a map when he was a stranger, and had known from the first evening that he was not a person to be suspicious of, and had led him in carefully, and then all the way. The stars came out one by one over the Texas Panhandle, over the red earth and the creek cottonwoods and the horse paddocks and the well-kept barn, and the solid stone house with its chimney that stood through everything, over a garden that had been planted in spring and would come up again in spring, over a piece of painted buckskin on a shelf between a surveyor's journals and a horse ledger, over 2 children sleeping in the knowledge that the ground beneath their feet was theirs, and that they knew where they came from. On both sides and all the way back. John Reed sat on the porch of the homestead that had become his home in the most complete sense of the word, with his wife's hand in his, and the sound of the country around them and the stars coming in. And he was, in a way that needed no further addition and no qualification and no continued searching, entirely and at last arrived. In the spring of 1887, Letitia began teaching Marcus the basics of survey work, taking him out on the south section with the instruments her father had left her, and showing him how to read the land in degrees and distances. Marcus, at 7, was serious and fascinated, and asked the questions twice that John had noted he always asked twice, once to understand and once to be sure. Clara, at 4, came along and sat on a rock and observed with the focused dark-eyed attention that Clara Simmons, the midwife, had noted in her first hours and that had not diminished. Eli Torres, now 22, had become so essential to the horse operation that John had offered him a share in it, a small percentage of the profits in exchange for the commitment and the skill, and Eli had accepted with a dignity that told John he had understood the weight of the offer. The operation ran well because all 3 of them understood what they were doing and trusted each other with it, which John knew from the cattle drive years was the essential thing in any partnership. The trust, which was either there or it wasn't and couldn't be manufactured from good intentions alone. John rode to the county seat in the summer of 1887 and had a conversation with the land registrar about ensuring that the survey records were complete and unambiguous, the kind of conversation that cost nothing except an afternoon and that paid forward in security for the next generation. He rode home with the paperwork in his saddlebag and showed it to Letitia, who read it with the same careful precision she always brought to documents, and then put it in the cedar trunk where the important papers lived, next to the original survey documents and the letter from Samuel Bright and a pressed flower that had been in the Bible when John had opened it that first day in Missouri, and which had come with him all the way. That August, another letter came from Nana at Fort Sill. It was a longer letter than the previous ones, and in it Nana wrote about the conditions on the reservation, the things that were difficult and the things that were being held on to, the language and the stories and the ceremonies conducted as quietly as they could be managed. She wrote that she thought of Estaca every day and that she continued to tell the stories Estaca had told because that was how things were kept. She wrote that she had married a man named Quanah and that they had a son, and that the son's name in English was translated as something like Little River, which she thought Estaca would have approved of. She wrote that she was glad John Reed had come to Tule Creek that spring in 1878, that Estaca had talked about it for weeks afterward, that it had given the old woman something she had been waiting for without entirely knowing it. John read the letter aloud to Letitia at the kitchen table, with Marcus listening from across the room in the way children listen to adult things, carefully and pretending not to. When he finished, Marcus said, "Is Nana the lady who knew your mother's people?" "She's the one who translated for the elder woman who knew them," John said. "Her name was Estaca. She's the one I told you about, the one who kept the buckskin." Marcus looked at the shelf. "Can I touch it sometime?" "Come here," John said, and Marcus came across the kitchen, and John took the buckskin from the shelf and put it in Marcus's hands carefully, showing him how to hold it flat. "These are your great-grandmother's colors," John said. "Red for the earth, yellow for the sun." Marcus looked at it with the expression of a child holding something serious. Clara, hearing the change in tone from across the room where she had been playing, came to stand at John's knee and look up at the buckskin with her gray-green eyes. "Estaca," she said, which was a word she had heard many times and associated with something important, though she did not yet fully know why. "That's right," Letitia said from across the table. "Estaca, that's part of your name." Clara considered this with the focused seriousness of a 4-year-old receiving information she intends to use. Then she nodded once, with a finality that said the information had been filed. John Reed looked at his family in the morning light, in the kitchen of the homestead that had been Letitia Brooks's father's work, and then Letitia's work, and then theirs together. And he thought about the letter that had been waiting in a cedar chest, and the long ride south, and the map drawn by lamplight and the woman who had drawn it. And he thought that the thread of it, from the letter to this kitchen table, was one of the most coherent and complete things he had ever been part of. He had come looking for where he had come from. He had come looking for his mother's people, the ones who shared her blood, the ones who could tell him who he was in the part of himself that had never had a name. And he had found Estaca and the stories and the painted buckskin, which was everything he had come for. And he had found something he had not known to look for, had found it in a woman who was standing at a paddock fence with her back to him in the late afternoon light, who had turned and looked at him with gray-green eyes that were direct and measuring and entirely unafraid, who had handed him coffee without ceremony and drawn him a map without being asked to, and who had built something real and lasting on the land her father had left her, and had not moved an inch in the face of any pressure to do otherwise. He had found, in a homestead in the red earth country south of the Canadian River, on the land his mother's people had ranged across and been driven from, and that was now Letitia's land and his land and their children's land, the whole and rounded shape of who he was and who he was going to be. The cottonwoods along the creek turned gold in October, and the garden came up green in May, and Marcus grew into a boy who could read survey marks at 9 and ride fence line at 10, and who asked his questions twice without apology. And Clara grew into a girl with dark eyes and gray-green eyes somehow at once, who spoke to horses in her own language, and was right about the weather with a frequency that her father found both familiar and extraordinary. Eli Torres stayed, and the operation grew, and the fences held, and the surveys were on record, and the cedar trunk held all the important papers, including a letter from Missouri, and a receipt from a county land registrar, and a copy of a survey dispute resolution, and a letter from a woman named Nana at Fort Sill. And on the shelf, the painted buckskin held its red and yellow colors through the years, because Letitia kept the air in the house clean and dry, which was a practical thing she did for practical reasons, and which preserved the buckskin as a consequence, which was how she tended to take care of most things, from a practical direction, and with effects that turned out to be larger than the immediate task required. They had one more child in 1889, a second boy who came in March with the spring mud and the first green, and who was named Samuel Reed, for Samuel Bright, who had written the letter that started everything. Clyde Hannigan, who had driven 14 miles for the express purpose of meeting the baby, held Samuel in his broad hands with the careful delicacy of a man handling something important, and said he was glad he had told John Reed about Letitia Brooks back in that spring of 1878, and that he considered himself owed a great deal of credit for how things had turned out. Letitia told him he was welcome to all the credit he liked since it cost her nothing to give it. John told him the same thing with less wit and more warmth, and Clyde went home satisfied. In the long evenings of that summer of 1889, with Marcus nearly 10 and Clara 6 and Samuel new, and the horse operation running well and the garden full, and the south boundary secured, and the surveys on file, and the painted buckskin on the shelf, and the cedar trunk holding the history of how they had gotten here, John and Letitia sat on the porch in the evening light in the way they had sat on the porch on all the evenings that had mattered. And they watched the sky do its extraordinary West Texas evening thing, and listened to the creek and the horses and the settling sounds of the house and the country around them. "We should write to Marcus's school teacher," Letitia said, "about the fall term." "I wrote last week," John said. She looked at him. "Did you?" "I did. She said he's ready for the next reader." Letitia was quiet for a moment in the particular way that meant she was pleased about something and was being precise about how much she showed. "Good," she said. A hawk made its pass over the creek in the fading light. The horses were settled. The stars were beginning to show in the east, one by one, the way they always did in the clear high air of the Texas Panhandle. "John," Letitia said. "Yes." "I'm glad you came back," she said. "After you found Estaca, I'm glad you rode north." He looked at her in the evening light. "This woman, this life." "So am I," he said. She leaned her shoulder against his arm, which was still not her usual way and therefore still meant everything. And they sat together on the porch of the home they had built on the land she had kept, and the ground that held all the history of everyone who had ever stood on it, while the stars came in over the red earth country, and the creek ran clear in the dark, and everything that needed to be said had been said, and everything that needed to be done had been done. And the rest was the good and ordinary abundance of a life that had found its shape and settled into it, whole.